all, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to the No-Till Market Garden Podcast, episode 12. Without a doubt, one of the most educational and fun interviews I've done to date was with today's guest, Kristyn Leach of Namu Farm in Winters, California. She has so many cool things going on, including working with Namu Gaji, a restaurant in San Francisco, on an exclusivity agreement, which she talks about. She's generating seed for Kitzawa, the seed company who I should say has one of the most dangerously fun catalogs around. And her style of no-till is incredibly unique. And the story of how she developed it is pretty cool. But before we get into that interview, I want to go ahead and announce that season 1 of this podcast will end in May. Yeah, the reason for this is mainly because I'm a full-time farmer. And also, I feel that in order to be an adequate and trustworthy host of this podcast, of notillgrowers.com, of my YouTube series on no-till market gardening, I have to be hands deep in the soil. I have to fully develop our own no-till system and show that it is ecologically and financially viable. That way I can have that perspective when I'm interviewing guests to share with you. So that said, and this is why I'm announcing this now, I have great ambitions for the second season, which I will do. Probably. Basically, this show is one of the great prides of my life, but it is expensive. There are actual fees that come along with it, like paying for the software, the host, and the website and all that, but also time. It just takes a lot of time. It takes no less than 4 hours per podcast prep time, interview time, editing time, posting time, all that time. So here's my challenge for you. If we can get the Patreon page up to $1,000 a month, at least $1,000 a month, before May, I will do a second season. I cannot guarantee I can do it otherwise. Hitting that goal will do a lot of different things. It'll cover the cost to maintain the site, to maintain the podcast, and to improve the equipment we use. It'll pay me a little bit for the time I put into it. Also, it'll allow me to pay Jackson Roulette, who helps me run this ship, and perhaps others to keep it going and contribute. You do not have to contribute more than $2 a month if we get enough contributors. Just go to patreon.com/farmerjesse and sign up. Not a Patreon person? That's fine too. You can Venmo us at notillgrowers or send a check or PayPal us, whatever. Whatever works for you. You can get in contact with us at notillgrowers@gmail.com. But that monthly contribution from Patreon is what this podcast will survive on. So go check it out. Go sign up. Keep this thing rolling, y'all. You're awesome. All right, enough from me. Let's get to our amazing interview with Kristyn Leach of Namu Farm. Kristyn Leach, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much.
I'm super excited to have you on. You've got so many cool things going on, and I've got so many questions, but maybe we could just start with some basics about what kind of acreage you're working with there at Namu Farm and the kinds of crops you specialize in.
Sure, yeah. So I'm on 2 acres within a larger farm that grows predominantly olives for olive oil. And we're right in the Central Valley of California in Winters. So yeah, I'm just leasing 2 acres of open ground and kind of just part of an older farmer's succession plan. And so he has kind of taken the role of being my mentor. And as he's been thinking about scaling back a little bit, he's given me the opportunity to lease different parcels within his farm. So mostly I grow all row crops, and predominantly crops that are kind of important to Asian American communities, and particularly, I guess, Korean. I'm Korean American. So we grow lots of different herbs and vegetables, a lot of just hot weather things, kind of, things that do really well in our sort of arid, really hot climate. So melons and soybeans and peppers. Lots of different kinds of herbs, things like that.
Nice. And you mentioned that that it's sort of a succession situation. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. When I started my farm 8 years ago, I have always just pretty much, I think similar to what you were just expressing, Jesse, I didn't necessarily, when I was younger, think that I would have my own farm. But when I was working on other people's farms, I started being able to just kind of utilize parts of their land in exchange for kind of being in a management position on other vegetable farms. So it kind of just slowly inched my way into having my own farming operation. So I started in Sunol, which is a little bit south and east of the Bay Area, and was just on about an acre growing vegetables, and was on a year-to-year lease, which I guess we'll get into it later, but kind of the style of farming that I was doing was, it was really scary to just have a lack of land security, just because a lot of what was informing my decision making was thinking about these kind of like really long-term outcomes that I was invested in wanting to see. So I started putting feelers out to see if there was another opportunity for me to lease land where someone would be willing to offer like 5 to 10 years. And yeah, I met Mike Madison, who's this really amazing and inspiring kind of ecological farmer in my region. He's written a couple of really amazing books. So someone that I just really looked up to, and I had been looking in his sort of neck of the woods, and he was trying to help me find, potential land. And finally, after a couple months, he just sort of put on the table like that he'd be willing to release 2 of the acres on his land with the possibility of kind of scaling up as he was thinking more and more about retiring. So it's been pretty amazing just because, for me, I had been farming for a really long time, but I didn't necessarily have like a lot of capital to one, ever buy land, but also just have to put in a ton of infrastructure from scratch. And so to go somewhere where there was a well and there was, a lot of really basic irrigation infrastructure in place and equipment that we could share, really kind of just helped set me up for success as much as was possible.
Wow, that's neat. That's a great story.
Yeah, it's a great arrangement.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about, in terms of those vegetables that you're growing, how are you marketing those?
So when I first started, I think I mostly was interested in growing Korean crops just because it was, for me, like a way to connect to my own heritage. And with such close proximity to the Bay Area, like even my farm now is in a pretty rural agricultural region, but I'm still only about an hour and 15 minutes outside of San Francisco and Oakland. So I knew that I could probably, I knew there was this really amazing kind of restaurant scene and food culture and people really passionate about different food ways in the Bay Area. So I just started having my own little side hustle where mostly was working with different chefs. And then I met these 3 brothers who own a restaurant called Namu, and we decided to just partner because they were interested in wanting to start their own farm. So we just decided to work together and just kind of explore what that would look like. And so after the first year of us, kind of working together, I would bring them stuff and kind of mock invoice them for what the value essentially would be. They decided to just want to have an exclusivity agreement. And so that's been the way it's been for the past 6 years.
Wow. So can you elaborate a little bit on that exclusivity agreement? That sounds interesting.
Yeah, definitely. So my first year when I wanted to start and sublease this acre from an old employer of mine, they put the money down, which was $1,000 for me to lease the land. And then I had worked out an arrangement with my employer to kind of use some of his greenhouse space and things like that. So I worked for this other farmer who's a tomato breeder, from 4 in the morning till 2 in the afternoon, and then did my farm at night as an experiment. So the whole first year, it's I just kind of invested my labor. Namu has put forward the money to secure the land. And then after that, we were trying to figure out okay, well, to what extent does having this much produce serve your restaurant? What financially kind of makes sense? And so they just sort of wanted to pay a flat rate for the whole year. And so that's just our arrangement. They just pay kind of a contract fee annually, and they get 3/4 of the whatever I produce, basically. And so we have it kind of parsed out, and I have a lot of spreadsheets to just kind of go off of at this point, harvest projections. And at this point, we're pretty well established, so have a pretty good grasp on what we do anticipate producing volume-wise. So we just kind of have that all pencil out, see roughly how much we are producing, and they just pay that each year.
Wow, that's a cool agreement.
Yeah, it's been really amazing, and I think that, yeah, again, for me, I just sort of in my position when I wanted to start, there were just a lot of things that were just, I guess, mostly financially restrictive. And so I think having them just like invest not only the money, but also just kind of have this early belief in me when I was just kind of like this younger farm worker, just meant a lot in terms of confidence. And I think it also, you know, in that first year, the most valuable thing to me was their investment. Like, to me, just meant that we were sharing the risk of things. And when I started the farm, I was just like coming at it from like a really kind of naive but really idealistic place of being like really inspired by Fukuoka, really curious about these kind of like peasant farming methods that I knew of from Korea, and just curious about how I could merge that with like what I knew from working on commercial like vegetable production farms in the States. So it was like really kind of like an exciting thought exercise, and I was also just increasingly concerned with climate change, and just even seeing on some of the farms that I worked at, you know, like, wait, if we trace this back, like, where is our fertility coming from? And is my ability to grow food really reliant on, you know, other communities being impacted because their landscapes are like, you know, just having these valuable resources extracted? Like, there was just this web of things that to me felt kind of heavy and dubious. So I just felt like while I was young and plucky and naive and able-bodied, I was like, I'm going to just try to do this and have like no fossil fuel input. I'm going to try to also look at like the fossil fuel input in terms of like how fertility is derived, even in organic systems, and where there's that sort of ghost acreage in essence of like who's underwriting our fertility management. So kind of coming up with a closed loop system where a farm could be really well integrated into a native ecosystem where all of my fertility was being derived from like my really specific locale. So that was kind of the goal. And I think when I kind of like laid that all out for Namu, Dennis, who's the oldest brother and the chef, was just like, cool, yeah, that sounds really good. And I was like, oh, really? Like, this doesn't sound totally squirrely. I mean, like, I'm straight up telling you, my strong suit is not making a lot of money. I'm trying to do this kind of weird thing. He was like, yeah, I think what you're exploring is important. So we believe in the same things. Like, that's what drives our restaurant. So it was a good pairing.
That's great. And that shared risk element is really special when it comes to working with chefs, because certainly every farmer has that moment where a chef has come and asked them to grow something different or unique, or maybe even that's not great in that climate. And then a lot of times that risk falls on the farmer.
Yeah, exactly. And I felt like with some of the things that I wanted to do as a farmer, and some of the things that felt like the moral responsibility of like my generation of farmers, was to kind of like ask harder questions and yeah, just not try to think about like year to year, having everything pencil out. So it was just really trying to kind of let myself, I guess, make mistakes, as long as I knew that those mistakes were being like held by like a long-term vision and by decisions that felt like they were letting me try to square up just some of the principles and values that I wanted to hold. And I will say too, like, we'll probably get into this later, but from the seed preservation aspect, like, I think that ability to fail was really important in actually developing much more adaptive and resilient genetics and germplasm, because it was like, I remember the first year, all our cucurbits like started going down from cucumber beetles, and our neighbor was just like, oh, you know, I've got like an OMRI approved spray for that. I remember at the time just being like so stressed out and being like, this is my first opportunity to do something, and, you know, so much is on the line, but trying to put my ego aside in it and just being like, okay, well, you know, I don't want to spray something that's just for soft-bodied insects because that affects all these other things. So I'm just going to see what happens. And then just took the very small amount of seed that I could harvest from the members that were left standing in that population of like our Korean melons, for example, saved those seeds, planted it the next year. And so it slowly just gave me the ability to like see how incredible plants are and how much more adaptive they are in terms of just weathering all of these conditions. So it let me kind of shift my mindset from being like, let me try to make sure that my plants grow in this sterile environment where cucumber beetles don't exist, to being like, oh, I see cucumber beetles all over now, but they're not transferring any diseases. The bites that they're taking out of things are really not slowing my plants down. Like, we just found some way to kind of like meet in the middle. And I think having like a partner in that, where it was just kind of like that first year I got to really perceive it as an experiment, gave me a lot of latitude to do that.
Wow, that's really cool. So those melons have essentially been adapted to at least be somewhat resistant or indifferent to the cucumber beetle?
Yeah, definitely. There's just been like so many things that were like pest or disease pressure that and not always. I mean, I think that in some ways, like, seeds just become attuned to your farming practices. But yeah, I feel like there were just so many things that we struggled with in the first few years that by the time we left our old plot, like, everything had felt really well calibrated actually as a system instead of a series of disparate parts trying to like all coexist. So yeah, I've seen that in terms of disease resilience and certainly things that are less susceptible to the problems that different insect pests cause. I haven't found a way to make a gopher-resistant crop of any kind, but, you know, it is what it is.
Right. I know you guys have gophers that are voracious out there.
Oh, yeah. You guys don't have gophers?
Not so much. They're not so much. You spoke a little bit there about inputs and fertility and getting sort of doing a closed loop system. So I want to take that as an opportunity to talk a little bit about your growing methods and then maybe scoot into some Korean natural farming stuff. So let's just kind of go on a basic level. What is your style of no-till? How are you doing your bed preparation?
Yeah. So when I was starting, the thing that I had in my head as guidance was like thinking about hearing like older, really badass Korean farmers say like, you should be able to feed yourself with only a sickle and a hoe. Like, okay, like let me use that as my guideline. We ended up putting a broad fork in with that just because it's just too amazing of a tool to not use. But basically, I felt like looking at the type of no-till farming practices that I was feeling inspired by from Asia, and then also just looking at the kind of like sophistication and beauty of our kind of native prairie ecosystems in the U.S., and just thinking about like a prairie is generating soil organic matter without any human intervention. So like, what is there to glean from that? It's a lot of like, sure, a lot of perennial grasses, but a lot of also different kind of annual forbs, annual grasses mixed into it. So trying to kind of look at what's the recipe that's happening here. And then also thinking about, you know, kind of like riparian and forest ecosystems where there's like this really low and slow approach, and kind of combining all of these types of interesting ecosystems. So the main things that I could, if I had to distill it down in my mind when I was thinking about it, was like, okay, we need to think differently about the type of carbon to nitrogen ratio that we usually do for vegetable production and start to move more in this realm of the role of carbon in that. So I was like, okay, grasses, that's the best way to do this. Like if I'm going to do everything by hand, what's going to mimic the beneficial things of tillage for me? So just kind of research some different cereal crops, grew that very classic winter rye just because of the type of root biomass. Grew hairy vetch because I saw that as a surface residue, it still contributed a good amount of nitrogen to the soil. So a mix of, winter cereal rye, hairy vetch, a little bit of barley mixed into it, and some field peas. So that first year was just trying to base everything around this notion that if we're not going to be chopping and incorporating all of that tender biomass above ground, we need to build as much biomass below ground so that in lieu of disturbing that, as that sort of slowly dies back and breaks down, it's going to do all of those things that tillage does for us. It's going to introduce oxygen into the soil. It's going to have like these really complex compounds and plant exudates that'll feed microbial life in the rhizosphere. And all of that as it breaks down, like will feed not just a small succession of kind of like tender early succession bacteria, but kind of create this complex chain or relay that has to happen as bacteria give way to later succession fungi. So we grew all those grasses. We'd mow it once, kind of in the late winter, and try to promote those grassroots systems to start to tiller and go a little bit more lateral. And then in the spring, when we would prep our beds, we would mow that down just to the base again with our sickle, and then kind of just cut through the surface and strip till essentially, where either we'd use the broad fork to kind of like dig into the soil a couple inches and loosen it, and then finish it by just kind of cultivating lightly with a regular garden hoe. Or in the case of some beans and things, we might just use the hoe to very lightly scuffle the surface and direct seed our bigger crops like beans and corn into it. And then all of that surface residue got moved over the growing crops as a mulch. And in the first couple years, because we were working on a soil that just really wasn't very biologically dynamic, we did do some Korean natural farming inoculants. So we inoculated all our mulch with kind of mycorrhizal fungi that we collected from the creek near our farm, and also would kind of create a lactic acid bacteria and then bring it down in a tank and kind of just dunk all of our mulch as we put it at the base of the plant. So that was really the key thing, like utilize the power of how amazing those grassroots are, use the surface residue as a mulch. The other part of that, I guess, was also letting our cover crop go to pretty much full maturity. So for us in California, we're like, usually the ground starts to dry out in, anywhere between late March and late April. So choosing all of those grasses for me was like great, because if we let it go to full maturity, we weren't totally drying out the soil. We weren't planting something broadleaf like a fava bean that was going to transpire a lot of that moisture out. We wanted to like kind of bank as much moisture. And so when we let the seed harden in the grain, the really great thing is all of those grasses have a summer dormancy for us because it's so dry that only in the late fall, as we start getting a little bit of precipitation and as the day lengths shorten again, that cover crop would actually seed itself and come up in the understory below our cash crop, which did two things. One, it reduced our need to buy cover crop or as much cover crop seed from year to year. And it also just let us keep the cash crops in the field for as long as possible. So say something like eggplants, I could be harvesting eggplant until we really got our first hard freeze, instead of having to kind of make that decision like, when am I going to disc everything in order to seed my cover crop, and timing that with the moisture. It really lengthened our season where everything just winter killed and those crops were left standing in the field and our cover crop just kind of came up around it.
No, that's great. So let me just make sure that I have it. So how did you get those cover crops in originally? Did you kind of do that same sort of broad fork it back and scuffle it up and then sow those cover crops?
Yeah, or we would just under sow things and then kind of with the sickle chop our standing crops in and let the residue cover it. Or we'd use like a little tined cultivator, like the little claw, and just under sow the cover crop in that understory, and then just kind of scuffle it enough where the seed could get tamped in, so there was some good, just soil pressure.
Okay, that's neat. So then once those cover crops are established, you let them grow over the winter, and then you mowed them once to kind of get a little bit more root growth and get them to kind of inspire a little bit more photosynthesis. And then in the spring, you're basically chopping out the green matter, leaving the roots, but kind of working up that top little, inch or two of soil, and then you're planting directly into that. Is that accurate?
Yes, exactly. And I know with like the other folks you're talking to, like no-till actually is like, there's a whole, it's the whole realm and very different techniques. And I think for us, like, ours is just really so location specific about like the challenges of like our ecosystems, and just the little bit of container that we had of just being like really wanting to generate all of our own kind of organic matter and not wanting to kind of be top dressing a lot with compost. So it was just kind of thinking about a system that if we could refine it or tinker with it, could still go back to some of the subsistence farmers that I know in Korea and geek out with them, but it wouldn't be kind of so removed or like really capital intensive or really dependent on them being able to access fertility being like kind of purchased or brought in. And so those were kind of like the limiting factors, because I know a lot of people have different notions about, like absolute no tillage, where it is you're just kind of like layering soil above and kind of amending as you go. But for us, we're just kind of like, okay, we don't want to be buying a ton of stuff. Let's just try to use what we have and run a pretty lean, native ecosystem here.
No, that's really neat, and I like that. I feel like it's worth taking a second to talk about how I feel like when we talk about no-till, sometimes I'll bring it up with older farmers that have tried no-till, and they kind of shrug and say like, I got tired of splitting hairs with people about what constituted no-till, and I think it's really neat to kind of take a step back and just say like it's more of a process of, feeding the soil and feeding the microbes and doing. I always take those three principles of like keep the soil covered as much as possible, keep it planted as much as possible, and disturb it as little as possible. And as long as you're doing that and kind of continuously trying to do less, that's pretty much no-till to me. And I think that because it's so subjective with that as possible word in there, that it just makes it so open. And I love hearing all these different styles.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely appreciate like that thoughtfulness that you just expressed, because I think my temperament just like leans really against this notion that there's like a silver bullet that's going to solve all of these problems, or just one like really easily packaged set of methods. Like, and I think for me, the guiding thing has always been trying to talk about like, yeah, the principles and the values and the kind of like underpinnings of like why no-till is good and like how you foster those conditions, rather than being like, okay, and first you do this and next you do this. Because I'll be the first to say like the way that I'm doing it like may not make sense for like, over 60% of people, living in various places. Like if you're in a place that, has a lot of precipitation in the summer, you're going to experience different challenges having this really thick mulch, like things are going to decompose at different rates. So to me, it's like, that's the exciting part about farming, is being like, to me, not having a prescription is like so inspiring, because it just like makes me have to think about like having a deep understanding of like why I'm doing what I'm doing. And I like that with cooking. I like that with other things. It's like, I'd rather geek out about fermentation so I can know how to make a million kinds of pickles based on a set of some guiding rules, rather than like, have a million pickle recipes that just tell me what to do,
Yeah, that's great. Really well put. I absolutely agree. And I feel like I know that I was at the Acres conference this past weekend, and the Gabe Brown was saying, and several people were saying, like, especially in the no-till talks, like, I don't have the recipe. And I think that's really cool. And I also think it's really cool to share what your methods are, because somebody can go, oh, well, I can take a little bit of that and do that because I have those tools, or I have that setup, or like I like using cover crops, and I can use them in that way. I think I think sharing the information like that is really cool.
Yeah, exactly. Like if it's just like you kind of glean these different things where it's like something inside of you is like, oh wait, like this, like, yeah, feels really appropriate to what I'm going for. But for me, it's like farming I love just so much because it's just never going to not be fascinating. It's like you're just never going to stop learning. And so even though it's like, oh, you have to kind of keep on your toes or like things aren't going to feel like really rote processes from year to year, yeah, I think the thing that I would like to discourage people from doing is feeling discouraged because people are trying to be more purist about it, like, oh yeah, there's the way to do this. And if that sort of limits people in exploring no-till, then I'm like, oh, it's a real disservice to the whole arena of agriculture because we need a lot of creativity right now.
I totally agree. So you said you weren't adding any sort of compost, or is that accurate?
We added compost in the beginning years, and I'd say for like the last 3 seasons on the farm, we didn't add any compost. Because at that point, like, the best analogy I have is like the way that I knew how to farm, where it's like we grew a really legume-heavy cover crop, we dipped it, we shaped beds, we tilled it. You know, you've got that really sweet sort of like crest of the wave where if you hit it and you get your plants in on time, like they're going to capture all of that nitrogen that's plant available and being mineralized. And you're kind of coasting, and the compost just kind of helps bolster that. And to me, that's kind of like at the end of the year or the beginning of next season, you're trying to just kind of like supplement what you're taking out. So to me, it was like, oh, it's like when you're living paycheck to paycheck. And for me, what I felt like was happening in the first few years doing this system was it was like putting all your money in a savings account that you couldn't touch for a couple years. So we definitely had a little bit of a fallout in terms of just, nitrogen availability. Just the fact that we kind of did hit this wall where in the summer when it's so dry, like that straw is not breaking down. There's no like real biological activity happening. So we had kind of like used a certain amount of energy to grow a really lush, good cover crop, but those nutrients weren't being really totally recycled because of that low and slow approach. So for the first 2 years, we did a lot of like compost teas and trying to kind of like foliar feed and just give the plants what they needed and let the soil try to recalibrate. But by the third year, like probably the middle to end of the third year, we started seeing like this accumulation of organic matter way beyond what we were taking out. So it became this truly generative system where we didn't have to add any input because we created such a reserve in that soil because there was just, 2.5 years of just like high carbon matter that was now just like really kicking into high gear decomposing, and we're getting these really beautiful kind of like mycelial networks breaking down those harder types of cellulose. So then it was just like so rich. So at that point, everything kind of just was so dynamic because it just had the time it needed for like one thing to feed another thing, to feed another thing. And just our timeline just became a little bit different. So then that last few seasons at the old farm, we just didn't have to, we didn't have to amend at all just because then at that point there was enough activity to kind of just like we just kept adding that organic matter. It was just like, layering year after year of that mulch. And during the little bit of rainy season that we had, that mulch starting to break down around that growing cover crop. So we were starting to get that buildup of topsoil by the end of it.
Hey, you all, just jumping in to remind you that notillgrowers.com is live, and I will be doing a regular blog there about my farm and greater trends in the no-till market garden world. So go check it out. Hit up the forum and challenge, folks like Alex Eakins and myself or one of the many other resident contributors there with your no-till questions. It's a super fun and no dogma forum. And don't forget that all that stuff I said about the Patreon page in the beginning of this episode, if you want to see a second season in the fall, go to patreon.com/farmerjesse and make it happen. All right. Isn't Kristyn awesome? Let's get back to her. So I want to talk a little bit about the seed saving that you're doing. And can you elaborate a little bit on that and talk a little bit about who you're working with and how you're going about that?
Yeah, definitely. So again, it was just one of those things, like a couple years into farming, I bought a lot of seed from Kitzawa Seed, which is now 101 years old. It's based in Oakland. It's probably the oldest seed company focusing on Asian vegetable varieties in the States. So I got to know them just because I was buying a lot of seed from them, and they ended up coming to the farm and seeing what we were doing and, you know, being really curious and kind of excited about it. So they asked me to do their field trials for different varieties and kind of give them feedback. And because we work with the restaurant, had that added tier of, you know, having culinary professionals also try out these different crop varieties. So we did field trials for them for several years, and it was really illuminating too, just because I think I just realized in the type of like system being lean in the way that it was, or kind of just having that carbon nitrogen ratio be a little bit different than what is in most commercial vegetable operations. A lot of those varieties that we were getting weren't totally thriving when up against these kind of like heirloom or land races that we've been selecting for on our own farm. And so I was like, oh, it's just sort of like makes sense that things have to kind of, get used to this environment where they're being put. So I just got really curious about those things and just like the role that seed played, because I had been geeking out so hard about soil. But then was like, oh, this is this whole other thing that, like, when we talk about no-till, we think all the focus is on in the ground, but those crops and how they respond and thinking about what type of system they've been selected and bred for actually impacts our abilities to, like, do a really good job as no-till farmers. I just got really a lot more curious about developing a seed bank that would be able to thrive in a no-till system or in a low-input system or organic system. And I think, it's just inspiring, so many people I think are thinking about this right now, particularly just the state of organic seed and just knowing that it's not a negligible matter, like all the things that are tied up in like how that seed has been produced and what that plant is used to translates to us as like the consumer of that seed trying to grow it in our farms.
Yeah, that's so neat because it's definitely, seeds adapted to chemical agriculture, nitrogen fertilizers, those sorts of things. Definitely may not be used to the sort of slow release of fertilizers in an organic system, or especially perhaps maybe in a no-till system.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think it's just like, it seems like such a no-dumb moment at this point. I'm like, oh, I hear myself saying, I'm like, oh yeah, of course. But I think for so long, like being critical of things like the Green Revolution, I saw all the negative impacts of that. I was like, oh, I can see the way seeds like this Trojan horse that just like comes in and promises this thing. But really, it's like this sneaky way to just like dismantle these types of traditional farming systems. And it's a way to introduce a really chemical intensive farming system. So I could see the way that it's like, oh, these industrial seeds are promoting an industrial system. But I just never thought about it in that more like regenerative way where it's like, oh, but if seed can do that, seed can go in the other direction too. Like we should just be tending to and like caring for the seeds that like let us farm the way we want to farm. So like, oh yeah, I just gotta like reprogram my brain to not just be critical of what's so bad about, industrial or genetically engineered seed and think about what is the type of seed that will really work in harmony with the way that I want to farm.
Yeah, I love that. Like the potential for a seed to really, really adapt to your methods. Yeah, that's such a beautiful thing. It would be nice to see more seeds that are not just certified organic, but like that there's some way of knowing how they're grown. Because you never even know, even the organic seeds, you don't know if they were mostly fish fertilizers or if they were compost grown or what. I mean, and that can have a big, I imagine, I don't know what the studies are, but I imagine that it can have a fair effect on your yields and on just the overall health of that crop.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that like over the past couple of years, getting to work with like professional plant breeders and other people that really love the seed, like also feel like reminding them like, yeah, but genetics isn't the cure all, like if you look at Monsanto, like they're breeding drought resistant corn because they think they found like the one sort of sequence of a genome that helps with RNA transfer during periods of drought. And it's like, yeah, you can isolate things to the sum of their parts. But actually, like, you can't dismiss, like, a trait like drought resilience is so complex and so tied to, like, proper agronomy. And I think that we just think, like, oh, we can tinker with plants like they're these little Frankensteins, to the dismay of, like, trying to also encourage good farming practices, you know? And so I think it is just really exciting to think about the role that seed plays, and trying to, like, just share that excitement and build more consciousness and learn more for myself about just, like, how that really does play a role. Like, for example, we grew these two kinds of eggplants, like this really beautiful heirloom Japanese eggplant called Kamo, and then the traditional Taiwanese Pingtung Long, and just weren't doing a great job with it. I was like, you know what, eggplants actually like a lot of fertility, and either I'm going to be like the world's like kind of most mediocre eggplant grower, or I'm going to try to like be a little more proactive. So this is like the one thing where we like really set out to do a more aggressive kind of like variety improvement, where for the first 4 years, I just grew double the amount I needed. So I grew 4 rows of each of those eggplants. And 2 of the rows I grew just for fresh market production. And I kind of tried to give it everything it wanted. I'd side dress it when it seemed like it needed it. I gave it the water it needed. And the other half of the rows, I just gave 50% less. And I gave no fertilizer. And so then we watched something funky happen. And as you could tell, like, those 50% of the plants, like, really did not like me. They looked really gnarly, felt pretty miserable, but were able to get some viable seed from it. And then over those 4 years, it's like that gap started to close, where it was like, oh, wait, these ones that were giving less, they're actually performing just as good as the ones we're giving so much to at this point. Like, they're getting used to, like, what's happening. And whatever things that, like, I'm not a plant geneticist, so I don't know how to really pinpoint, but I'm like, there's something that we've been able to kind of narrow down in selecting from this population that is just better suited to thrive in this environment, better suited to thrive with less water, doesn't need a kind of fertilizer package. So now we're able to just grow all of it for production, and it's integrated in our system, producing like way better than we could have ever imagined. And that's in a pretty short period of time, you know, that's like 5 years of commitment to failing and, you know, using some real estate on your farm for something that's just essentially a seed crop. But now the returns for me are just like really amazing. And I think those are the types of things, like, I always hesitate to try to, you know, monetize this, because I think in some ways it's like, oh, it's, you know, like all of us that care about this, it appeals to you on this heart level. But I know that for farmers, we have to make a case for it because there's so much economic pressure on us as like small scale vegetable growers. And those are the things that to me do reflect in the bottom line, not just that I'm not buying seed at this point, but that the quality of my seed affects my, you know, it affects my expenses in so many different ways. Where it's like, if I'm not buying fertilizer and I'm not buying seed and I'm using less water, those are 3 really expensive things. Those are 3 things that really can add up at the end of a year, and I'm just reducing all of them.
That is such a cool story. So I'm wondering if you have any tips for how an aspiring seed grower can kind of do that on their own.
Yeah, totally. And like, it's really fun and really interesting. And like, I mean, I think it's just mostly from, again, taking calculated risks and then paying attention. But kind of like the setup that I laid out for you, like when we have worked on more deliberate projects with plant breeders, the advice they gave us is like, if you don't actually kill 50% of your population, what you're seeing, you don't know if you can chalk it up to coincidence or actual improvement. So you do have to do things that like are going to feel uncomfortable in terms of like, you know, watching plants suffer and yes, sacrificing that space and not getting to yield necessarily a ton in the present. But I think if you think about the type of stress that you believe a crop needs to acclimate to, and you apply that stress in a calculated way, and then just try to think of what its window and threshold is, where you're not just like murdering everything. But if you see some things surviving and some things not, then you just kind of tag the plants that are doing reasonably better and save those seeds. And then you have a couple options where either you can like save individuals of a population as like their own siblings, as like a progeny line, and then plant them out as almost like their own distinct varieties, or you just do mass selection, which is probably the easiest, where you just take all the seed collected from all the plants that did well, plant it out again as its own population, and kind of repeat that process. Like just keep identifying who your sort of little stars are within any population and just keep saving for that.
When you see your seeds being grown on other farms, assuming you do, are the sort of benefits replicated? Like are people in your area who use those seeds still able to get the same kind of response? Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. So we have trialed it with both different neighbors' farms and also trying to see it in slightly different conditions, and have gotten just generally pretty consistent feedback. And sometimes like farmers haven't wanted to kind of push it to the extent of what we were doing. So I think at a certain point, because we were able to cut down our water consumption on what we were doing, like the first year on my farm, I had to water basically between 3 and 4 hours every other day just to kind of keep things at a medium level. And by the end of my time at our old plot, a lot of things we were watering for like 40 minutes a week. So that's just sort of anecdotally, to me, the most compelling thing because of being in California was like using less water. Like how are we going to farm with less water? So that was like one of the main metrics we looked at. So even though we shared a lot of seed with other folk, they weren't necessarily still doing other practices that made it so I could be like, yeah, water this 40 minutes a week and see if it works. But they would just sort of use it in their general farming system and see if it kind of worked against the commercial standard. And a lot of times, yeah, it was very worthwhile. Like we got a lot of good feedback just on a general hardiness and vigor. And in some cases, like with the eggplants, like just yield being improved from some of these heirlooms.
That's a super cool and inspiring story. Do you have any more that you'd like to say about Korean natural farming? Is there anything about Korean natural farming that you're still doing? I know you mentioned you were doing it early on. Are you still kind of implementing some of that?
I am now because, since moving the farm, we're kind of starting from square one again. And so, this winter, just spent kind of like bringing leaf mold and stuff and spreading it on the soil where the cover crop is coming up and kind of doing a lot of those same things, trying to kind of culture and inoculate our agricultural soil with some of the native soil microorganisms. I think that the one thing I will say is like, I think Korean natural farming, because of Master Cho and the sort of focus on the ferments, like I think that's what comes to mind for a lot of people. But natural farming as a term is just kind of like the way I was even able to access information about like organic farming in Korea. Because when I was younger, I was like wanted to go back to Korea and was curious about organic farms. I just couldn't find anything. Like I found some things about people who were starting to do host woofers and stuff like that. Then I realized it was just more of a linguistic thing. And natural farming in Korea, for the most part, just kind of means like that, like no input, minimal access to capital, like closed loop system. So almost kind of like, akin to some of the things of what people know about lactic acid bacteria, endomycorrhizae, inoculation. But it doesn't necessarily mean all of those preparations. It means more of an overarching farming system. So by and large, most of the farmers that I have stayed with and worked with in Korea don't really do a lot of those things. But they are doing things that exactly are that essence. Like they're taking all of their neighbors' rice hulls, or they're going into the woods and making some form of biochar. But again, it's like, I remember reading One Straw Revolution when I was younger and being like, wow, I'm so inspired, but what the heck was this guy talking about? Like, I thought I'd know how to do no-till farming after reading this. I'm like, this is no manual on farming. And then realizing, like, some of the beauty is in that philosophy of just being like, I'm not going to tell you what to do. Like, I'm going to just tell you, like, the beauty of, like, what I see working in concert with one another. And I'm going to tell you about, like, this love I have of, like, the land that I'm on and how specific that is. So I think with learning from some of the farmers I learned from, too, it's both that thing that makes you want to pull your hair out, where it's like, can't you just tell me what to do? But the reluctance to do that is almost kind of part of the spirit of it. Just being like, no, we're not prescriptive. We're about principles, you know, like not just a set of systems. So that's the one thing, like sometimes people really like to geek out. And when I started the farm and we joined Instagram, I got all of these people following me that was like 420 for life and, you know, like ganja lover. And I'm like, whoa. I was like, why are all these weed growers following me? I was like, this is so weird. And I realized it's because Korean natural farming has become such a kind of popular thing with cannabis growers. So many people were emailing me, and I was like, I don't grow weed, you know, like I grow vegetables. But it was interesting that was like the context where it's been really embraced, where for the most part, when I was learning, I couldn't find a lot of information outside of like Hawaii as far as the United States went. So it's interesting now to kind of just see that.
Yeah, it's funny if you ever click on the, maybe for the listener, if you ever click on the KNF hashtag, you will see 99% pot plants. It's unbelievable.
I mean, yeah, it's so fascinating. I was like, oh, this is kind of how, like, with biodynamics, like, you know, some of their biggest champions were really from the wine industry. And I was like, oh, why is it, like, all this kind of recreational use stuff is what is embracing kind of forward-thinking agricultural practices. But, yeah, for a long time I was just laughing. I was like, oh, my Instagram is just, like, a beacon to stoners. And I, like, just talking about boring vegetables, like. But, yeah, if you're interested, like, through Kitzawa, we're, like, rolling out a lot of seeds over the next couple years, and they've given me the opportunity to develop a seed line called Second Generation that is just really focused on this, like, being like, oh, what's the heart of our agricultural traditions? What are, like, the seeds that are a part of it? And that's what we're trying to share, and it's been kind of a challenge to think about, yeah, even talking with farmers, like trying to share the importance of like how seed factors into it, not to mention that added level of being like, and look, if you want to try farming it this way, like, you know, these seeds can kind of handle a little bit more stress. They're totally not fussy. They're a little feral. Like, go out on a limb. Maybe like don't fertilize this row, or you don't have to buy compost for us. But yeah, it's been interesting working with them to try to convey that to the consumers.
That's great. I love that story, and I like the idea of it kind of coming with the seed of getting a better understanding of the sort of environment in which it was bred.
Yeah, definitely. And just being like, oh, this is like another thing that really speaks to a place, a time and a place, and just that a lot of the things that we focus on for the first 5 crops that we're selling seeds for are just, yeah, they're really significant crops to kind of like the Korean diaspora. And so not only are they kind of selected for like the type of farming system that we have, but we're also trying to like use those seeds as a lever to kind of like, you know, organize within our communities so people come together and have their perspectives also included, just thinking like the way food cultures evolved was like kind of farmers selecting for what people in their region thought was like delicious or beautiful or useful. And so we want to kind of like also hold that as part of our traditions too, of just being like, well, we don't want just plant breeders to be thinking about this, and we don't want people in institutions just calling all the shots. Like, we do want like that grassroots, like from the ground up approach to be like, we want grandmas involved, and we want young people involved, and we want teenagers that, you know, like if we don't talk about this soon, they may never recognize this crop because the generation that is really familiar with it is dying. So kind of just trying to bring together the richness of all of these things. Like the type of farming we want to participate in is one that is really multifaceted and dynamic, and that's what we want to also cultivate in the sense of like our social fabric.
Kristyn Leach, this has been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I love hearing your perspective on seeds and all that stuff, and you're gonna have to come back on at some point.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and I want to interview you sometime and hear about your trek from journalism into farming and back again and all sorts of things. But thank you so much. I'm a big fan and appreciate what you're doing.
All right, you all, if you enjoyed Kristyn Leach, you can follow her at Namu Farm on Instagram or Facebook. All the relevant links will be in the show notes. Also, follow us while you're on Instagram or Facebook at notillgrowers. Just go to notillgrowers.com every day, all the time. Check it out, comment on stuff, engage in the forum, all those good things. Sign up for our Patreon page, patreon.com/farmerjesse. And also you can Venmo us money. Venmo is like an app where you can send people money who, you owe money or you just want to give them money. Venmo. It's a super easy app. Go check that out. You can always Venmo us a couple bucks if you just love an episode and want to show your support. That's awesome. Otherwise, you all, thanks for listening. You are awesome. We'll see you next week. Bye.